At the end of the 19th century, the world was changing at an unprecedented speed. Science and technology were transforming everyday life. But while everyone looked at the present, Herbert George Wells was looking much further ahead. Time travel, instant communication, space exploration, genetic manipulation. Ideas that seemed like pure fantasy, yet he described them with unsettling precision. How did he do it? Just imagination? Or did he know something more? In this video, we'll explore not only his novels and prophecies, but also the mysteries that surrounded his life. Because behind the visionary author, there was a man surrounded by secrets, theories, and unexpected connections. Herbert George Wells was born on September 21st, 1866, in Bromley, Kent, England. His family was modest, not to say poor. His father, Joseph, was a gardener. His mother, Sarah Neal, worked as a housekeeper in a mansion. In 1874, when Herbert was 8 years old, an accident changed his life forever. While playing, he fell and broke his leg. Confined for weeks, his mother began bringing him books from the mansion's library where she worked. There, in that narrow bed, he discovered that paper could be a portal. He read about explorers crossing jungles, fallen empires, impossible machines. Years later, he would say, "It was as if I'd been given a one-way ticket out of time." Reality, however, was far from an adventure. His family could not afford his education, and at barely 14 he was forced to work. A harsh reminder that in Victorian England, dreams were out of reach for the humble. Everything changed in 1884 when he won a scholarship to study biology at the Normal School of Science in London under the tutelage of Thomas Huxley, a fierce defender of Darwin. There, he learned that evolution wasn't just a biological concept, but an unstoppable force that could be applied to entire societies, even the destiny of humanity. That idea would grow in his future novels, like a seed no one could uproot. After completing his studies, Wells worked as a teacher in private schools to make a living, though he never stopped writing in his spare time. In 1893, a lung disease left him bedridden, and doctors were clear he might not have much time left. It was then that he made a decision that would shape his destiny, leaving teaching behind to devote himself entirely to writing. Between 1893 and 1895, he published several short stories in magazines like Pall Mall Gazette, The Strand Magazine, and The Yellow Book. These stories blended science, social satire, and futuristic speculation, and many foreshadowed the themes he would later develop in his novels. In 1895, he published The Time Machine, his first novel. In it, a scientist invents a device capable of time travel and journeys to the year 802701, where he discovers two species descended from humanity, the Eloi, fragile and superficial, and the Morlocks, subterranean workers who prey on them. It was a warning disguised as fantasy. Wells was speaking about class struggle and the potential fate of humanity if social polarization continued. Wells didn't just invent an adventure, he created a new language for talking about time. Before him, time travel in fiction was little more than a magical trick. Wells gave it gears, levers, materials, and a driver, science. The realism was such that some readers thought he had described a real prototype, but there was more. In private circles, Wells spoke of having dreamed journeys in which he saw a worn-down world, the sun weakening, and Earth turned into a red desert. Some acquaintances claimed he spoke with such detail that it seemed like he was recalling a real event. After the success of The Time Machine, Wells went from being a young teacher with uncertain aspirations to one of the most listened to voices in England. Since his youth, he had deeply admired Jules Verne, whom he saw as a visionary. Moved by sincere gratitude, Wells wrote him a cordial letter, thanking him for his influence. But Verne's response was not what he expected. Far from welcoming him warmly, the veteran author accused him of distorting science and writing fantasies disguised as technological progress. In particular, Verne ridiculed the idea of a machine capable of traveling through time, calling it absurd and childish. According to him, at least his own works were based on real science. Wells, although disappointed, took the matter with a sense of humor. Years later, in an interview, he summed up the disagreement with irony. "Verne saw me as a literary bastard. Maybe I was, but at least I knew how to fly beyond the moon." In 1896, he published The Island of Dr. Moreau. The novel tells the story of Edward Prendick, a shipwreck survivor who arrives at a remote island in the Pacific, where the mysterious Dr. Moreau conducts gruesome experiments to transform animals into human-like beings through painful surgeries and biological manipulation. It was a brutal story, filled with scenes that many found unbearable. Wells said it was inspired by the debates about vivisection that stirred England at the time. But there was more. Years earlier, at the Normal School of Science, Wells had attended dissection practices that left him deeply disturbed. He would watch animals opened up on the table, their organs beating, and silently wondered if science's drive to improve nature would end up dehumanizing us. The hidden prophecies in the book were unsettling: genetic modification, absolute control over evolution, and the use of science as a tool for political domination. Decades later, with the rise of genetic engineering and military research, Moreau ceased to be mere fiction. Just 1 year later, Wells surprised and unsettled again with The Invisible Man, 1897. The story follows Griffin, a brilliant scientist who discovers how to become invisible by altering the refraction of light in his body. At first, visibility is a scientific achievement, but soon it becomes a curse, leading him to isolation, paranoia, and finally madness. Wells had been reading about optics and experiments with light, fascinated by the theoretical possibility of invisibility. But Griffin was not just a narrative experiment. He was also a portrait of how absolute power corrupts even the brightest minds. Some critics at the time suspected Wells was projecting something of himself onto Griffin, his growing feeling of being above social and moral rules. The Invisible Man's prophecies included concepts like advanced camouflage, total espionage, and technologies to hide identity, elements that, a century later, are part of many military arsenals. Wells was no longer just a promising young writer, he was a literary celebrity. Publishers competed for his manuscripts, and newspapers asked him for opinion articles on science, politics, and the future. A year later, in 1898, he published one of the most influential novels of all time, The War of the Worlds. In it, the peaceful fields of Surrey and the calm streets of London become the scene of a Martian invasion. The extraterrestrials, equipped with mechanical tripods, heat rays, and chemical weapons, devastate the human population, unable to defend itself against a technologically superior enemy. The idea came from a conversation with his brother Frank, imagining what would happen if an advanced power, like Britain in its colonies, were colonized by an even greater power. But some claim Wells did not limit himself to speculation. At that time, he attended meetings with military and scientific figures where advances in weaponry and war technology were discussed. Some say Wells heard about heat projectors and experimental gases and leaked the information disguised as fiction. The novel contained chilling prophecies, mechanized warfare, the use of chemical weapons, indiscriminate aerial bombing, and above all, the idea that no civilization is safe from extinction. Decades later, when tanks rolled in World War I and poisonous gases filled the trenches, the War of the Worlds stopped feeling like fantasy. The success of the War of the Worlds was immediate. The public was fascinated and terrified, but whispers began. How could a writer predict military technology with such precision? In 1899, Wells published When the Sleeper Wakes. The plot follows Graham, a 19th century man who falls into a deep sleep and wakes centuries later to find a futuristic London dominated by corporations, mass propaganda, and an elite controlling all resources. Graham, unwillingly the central figure in this world, discovers that his fortune and name are weapons others want to use. More than a century later, it's hard not to see echoes of When the Sleeper Wakes in our own reality. By the end of 1900, H.G. Wells was no longer just a popular writer. He was an uncomfortable figure for conservative England. His novels questioned Victorian morals, and so did his personal life. While the press portrayed him as a man of brilliant ideas, in private circles, he was known for his carefree attitude toward marriage and his endless list of lovers. In 1901, he published The First Men in the Moon. The story follows Cavor, an eccentric scientist who invents a substance called cavorite that can negate gravity, and Bedford, a ruined businessman who sees the invention as a chance to get rich. Together, they travel to the moon, discovering an underground civilization of insect-like beings, the Selenites, with a caste-based society and its own economic system. Wells didn't just tell a fantastic adventure, he described spacesuits, the need for pressurization, the effects of low gravity, and long-distance communications with precision. Remember, this was half a century before humans set foot on the moon. That same year, Wells traveled through France and Germany. In Paris, he attended demonstrations of early automobiles. In Berlin, he visited mechanical engineering workshops. He took frantic notes, as if everything would help him build his own map of the future. The result was Anticipations, 1901, a non-fiction book where Wells tried to predict what the 20th century would be like. He talked about modern roads, motor vehicles replacing horses, armored tanks capable of crushing armies, and a visual telegraph we might now identify as a proto-internet. Some contemporaries saw it as an intellectual curiosity, others as a threat. Some claimed Wells was preparing society to accept changes certain power groups already planned. It was as if behind the novelist's figure, an invisible advisor of the future was working. In 1905 came a modern utopia, where Wells imagined a world governed by a single government, where education and science shaped every aspect of life. He described something eerily familiar today, a global database with information on every citizen, accessible at any time by authorities. What sounded like bureaucratic fantasy in his time now looks a lot like the internet, mass surveillance systems, and big data. In 1909, Wells published Tono Bungay, a fierce satire on modern capitalism. The plot follows a young man helping his uncle sell a miracle tonic called Tono Bungay, which actually cures nothing but becomes a commercial success thanks to massive advertising. The novel is a biting portrait of media manipulation power and consumerism as an economic driver. Between the lines, Wells made it clear that masses can be led to buy and believe anything as long as the message is convincing. By the early 20th century, H.G. Wells had become an influential figure among England's intellectual circles, especially members of the Fabian Society, a group of progressive thinkers advocating social reforms and the peaceful gradual advance of socialism. In this context, he met Amber Reeves, a brilliant and radical young woman with whom he began a love affair despite being married. In 1909, Amber gave birth to Anna Jane, Wells's daughter. The scandal was immediate. In the moralistic Edwardian society, having a child out of wedlock was seen as a devastating blow to his public image. Although he accepted paternity and cared for the child, Wells's reputation as a provocateur and transgressor was forever marked. In 1914, he published The World Set Free. The novel presented a future where scientists discover how to release the energy of the atom and create bombs that, once detonated, burn uncontrollably for days, destroying entire cities. The book described nuclear fission effects with surprising accuracy, 30 years before the first atomic bomb existed. It wasn't just about physical destruction, but how the weapon would change world politics forever. Decades later, physicist Leo Szilard, one of the fathers of the Manhattan Project, confessed that it was after reading Wells that he began seriously thinking about nuclear chain reactions. Coincidence? After the chaos and destruction of the Great War, H.G. Wells didn't just return to writing, he emerged as an indispensable voice for understanding humanity's future. During these years, Wells was a tireless traveler and lecturer. He visited the United States, the Soviet Union, and various European countries, always seeking to influence political leaders and thinkers with his ideas about world government and the need for responsible technological control.
Look at these little countries all jammed against each other. It is reasonable to expect them to live at peace together today. Now notice this white area which I have superimposed upon this map of Europe. That is the size and the shape of the United States of America. With no military and political tensions within its borders, with free trade from end to end of that area. Consider the difference in conditions between America and Europe at the present time. This area, I think, does not represent the ultimate size of the possible human government, the necessary human government in the future.
In 1933, he wrote The Shape of Things to Come, a prophetic novel that chillingly described the outbreak of a new world war, the use of devastating weapons, and the eventual formation of a global government imposing peace through technology and social control. Many of his predictions came true, although his ideas were considered extreme and dangerous by most. During that decade, Wells no longer just wrote novels. He was a prominent public figure with strong opinions on politics, science, education, and the future of humanity. His vision of a world government, his approach to socialism, and his visits to the Soviet Union, where he even met Stalin, raised suspicions among British intelligence agencies. MI5 placed him on their list of potentially subversive figures, and for a time, some of his movements and correspondence were monitored. Curiously, Wells knew about it and didn't mind. He used to mock the matter publicly. "I'm sure my spies get more bored than my readers." At one point, he left a deliberately provocative note on his desk that read, "New novel, how to build a bomb of ideas." The truth is, although he wasn't an armed revolutionary, Wells was a mental revolutionary. And that, to some governments, was even more dangerous. The final years of H.G. Wells's life were marked by a mix of intellectual frustration, health problems, and disenchantment with humanity. Wells, once an optimist about human progress, began to grow increasingly pessimistic. The world wars, especially World War II, affected him deeply. For someone who had championed ideas like world government, universal education, and reason as tools for peace, seeing the world self-destruct was devastating. He suffered from diabetes, liver, and cardiovascular problems, yet he never stopped writing. His tone grew darker and almost existential. In 1945, he published one of his shortest and bleakest works, The Mind at the End of Its Tether, where he argues that humanity has reached the end of its evolution and that the world as we know it has no future. It is a disturbing text, almost a farewell, showing a tired but lucid Wells deeply critical of the path civilization had taken. H.G. Wells died on August 13, 1946, at his home in London at the age of 79. He died in relative solitude, without great tributes or crowds, although time would place him as one of the fathers of modern science fiction and a visionary of what was to come. Throughout his life, H.G. Wells wrote more than 100 works, including around 50 novels, numerous essays, short stories, plays, and non-fiction books. He compiled many of these stories in The Stolen Bacillus and Other Incidents, 1895, The Platner Story and Others, 1897, Tales of Space and Time, 1899, and The Country of the Blind and Other Stories, 1911, among others. During the 1960s and 1970s, when the world was beginning to face advances like space exploration, nuclear energy, biological warfare, and artificial intelligence, many looked back and were amazed. How was it possible that H.G. Wells had anticipated so much and with such precision? His ideas, global information networks, interstellar travel, enslaving technologies, which once seemed like distant fantasies, began to feel unsettlingly familiar. Even his vision of a world brain, a shared knowledge system, recalls too much what we today call Wikipedia or the internet. Over time, H.G. Wells's figure acquired an almost legendary aura. He was the man who imagined the atomic bomb before it existed, who described pandemics caused by invisible organisms, and who anticipated a world divided into biological castes long before Brave New World or 1984 were written. But above all, Wells left a chilling warning. The greatest danger did not lie in machines, but in the human mind itself.